This is Gary Breschini and Trudy Haberstad. This couple is hands down the premier expert archaeological team in the area, hands down. What we know about our Central Coast prehistory and archaeology today was largely gained by Gary and Trudy's research here on the peninsula for over 40 years. They predate the docent group.
They look like it.
Gary and Trudy have graduate degrees from Washington State University. They have researched, documented, and photographed archaeological sites throughout the local area, published dozens of technical papers and books. They give lectures and teach classes locally. They work with the Monterey County Historical Society. Gary's the president. There's a huge archival site, archival vault that they have there. It's an amazing chunk of history collected there, and that is a great resource for you history buffs. They also maintain an online bookshop, coyotepress.com, where you can search and buy books, their books as well as others. They're no stranger to the docent group. They have been our guest lecturer many, many times going back to the 1980s. We are very honored to have them here today, so sit back and find out how long ago was our area occupied by the Ohlone, and how did they get here, and what does that new DNA research reveal? And we might get a little tidbits on what's up with that rock art too. So thank you very much, and here we go. Here you go, Gary.
Thank you very much, and good morning.
Good morning.
We're glad to be here again. It's always fun. You're one of the best audiences around. You're interested and active, and we're before lunch, so you'll stay awake. What we'd like to do is take you on a journey back in time. We're going to go way back, in fact. We're going to look at the history and the prehistory of the Monterey Peninsula area. Now, you're all familiar with this area, but what's under your feet may be a little bit new to you. And so we're going to take a different look at the peninsula. You're all familiar with the golf courses we have. Well, when we look at a golf course like this, we see the 17th green at Pebble Beach as a 5,000, 6,000-year-old Indian site, because that's what it's built on. And we have the famous Lone Cypress. Well, we look at that, we see Point Lobos in the background. The cypress, well, those come and go, but Point Lobos is important. Another example, the famous Cypress Point Golf Club. Very exclusive. We got a chance to do some archaeology in there not long ago. And we found some fascinating things. So we look beyond the greens, beyond the fairways, underneath our feet, and we see all sorts of strange and wonderful things. So we're going to show you a little bit about these people and how they got here. Now, the standard theory for many, many years has been the people here came over the Bering Land Bridge at the height of the last glacier, maybe 15 to 20,000 years ago. They got into Alaska from Siberia, and from there they spread through central Canada into the rest of the United States and South America. But that theory is no longer current. We have evidence that prior to spreading into Canada and the rest of the United States, a small group came down the coast in watercraft. We don't know what kind, but rather than trying to climb over glaciers, a watercraft lets you go around them. And in fact, you can move very quickly. And so some of these people, it looks like, came down the coast, not just from Alaska, but all the way down to the tip of South America. And they did this very early. Now, one of the things that let them move so quickly is they didn't have to keep changing environmental zones. When you walk from the Alaskan area into the United States, you're going from the Arctic tundra to the high plains to the southwestern desert, and if you continue south, you're going through jungles. you have to change your adaptation every different time you go through one of these zones. Coming down the coast, you can stay in the kelp zone, essentially from Indonesia all the way up through the Aleutians and down south of Baja California. Then there's a gap, but you pick it up by Ecuador, and it's all the way down the west coast of South America. You stay in the same general environmental zone the whole way. So it was called Following the Kelp Highway. Now, one of the great pieces of evidence for this is some DNA. Up there on the top, OYNK, On Your Knees Cave. You can imagine how that name came. The interesting thing about that is a DNA type was found, D4H3. The site had a human remains, was dated 9,300 years ago. This shows where the same DNA type is found. All the way down the west coast of both North and South America, you have that same DNA type. And that really shows the progress of this coastal migration. And D4H3, there's only about 50 individuals, living individuals that had that. So that's a real marker for us. Now, one of the more interesting things lately is, in addition to coming down the coast, perhaps 15,000 years ago, we also have evidence that in western Montana, a Clovis site dated 12,600 years ago was recently announced to have that same DNA type. So again, very good evidence that the earliest migration spread out with this very odd, very rare DNA type. So it gives us a marker. We have some samples out right now being analyzed. We're hoping they're 73, 7,400 years old. We're hoping they come back with this DNA. So anyway, the people in this area could have been started somewhere around 15,000 years ago, because down south in southern Chile, we have Monte Verde, dated to 14,800 years. But since we put this slide together, there's been some suggestion that that site is 18,000 years ago. That would put the people by here even earlier. So the people in this area certainly could have been here 15,000 years ago. Now, the key to their adaptation was the kelp highway. And you see a lot of kelp all the way around the peninsula. But what you often don't see is what is associated with the kelp. And that's the resources. There are close to 1,000 species in the greater kelp environment, and that includes the shore. So you have fish, you have birds, you have all the shellfish, the seaweeds. You just have a very rich environment. On the shore you have deer and all the other animals that were used for food, all the plant foods. And in fact, the kelp environment itself helps calm the waves, which would make use of boats and fishing a little easier. So the kelp environment really does seem to have been the key to the earliest people in this area, and that pattern seems to have persisted for 10,000 or more, 12,000 years. These are some of the things that you can associate with the kelp environment. You're all familiar with the mussel. The earliest date we have on mussel shells in this area is 9,400 years. I'll show you a picture of the shell we dated in a little bit. The earliest abalone is 5,900. So the people started out using the mussel long before they shifted to the deeper water abalone. So the mussel was easy to get, and it was one of the main staples. We find mussel shell characteristic of all of the residential sites. Other resources include the seaweed. We found little calcium solid particles from seaweed back into the interior. Most seaweed doesn't have those, but there are a couple of species that do, and we can trace them. So we know they were using seaweed and transporting it inland. Another bit of evidence is the fishbone. we have experts who, for a price, can identify what fish these tiny bones represent. And from knowing what fish we have, we can infer the fishing technique. We found barracuda bones in many of the sites. And we find sardines. You have different fishing techniques for each of those. In fact, there's a site in Rancho San Carlos that had quite a few fish bones. 99% were sardines. You take a sardine, you dry it in the sun, and it becomes, in essence, a vitamin pill. The fish oils are converted by the ultraviolet, and you've got the trace minerals from the ocean. A perfect vitamin pill, and also once dried, it can be transported very easily. As you might imagine, the deer was one of the primary food sources. We find deer bones in virtually all the sites. These are some of the bones that came from sites just here on the peninsula. The far left is a humerus from a grizzly bear. That was found in Pacific Grove. Next to it is a mandible, also from a grizzly bear. We didn't have the smaller bears here. The species here was the grizzly. Now that mandible, we actually got a radiocarbon date from that. That came from Pacific Grove, and the date was 2,950 years. So 3,000 years ago, they were able to, in some manner, capture a bear. The bones to the right are sea mammals. We have the larger bones are the seals, sea lions. The smaller one in the middle is a sea otter. We found a lot of the sea otter bones in the sites. And the one at the bottom is a jaw from one of the seals or sea lions. So in addition to using the mussel, the abalone, they were also eating most of the sea mammals. A site in Pacific Grove, we found a skeleton dating 5,300 years, and the dietary indications from some stable isotopes, 91% marine organisms in the diet. And dominant in that was the pinniped. So the early folks were continuing the pattern that was set by the ancient peoples here 10,000 years earlier of marine resource harvesting. But they didn't limit just to the marines. As you saw from the grizzly bear bones, they were using a lot of land mammals as well. Now, capturing or knocking off a grizzly would be a formidable task. The early Spanish really were bothered by the grizzlies. During the Mexican era especially, when they had what was called the hide and tallow trade, they would ship the cattle hides and the fat out, and they'd just leave the meat in the fields. And what do you think the bears did? They ate that, and they were happy and multiplied, and they were a big problem. We find sea otter bones in virtually all of the coastal sites. And it's kind of interesting. Now that we have 600 or 700 radiocarbon dates, we're starting to get a picture of the pattern through time. And the early peoples, from 6,000 to 7,000 years ago up to about 3,000, had small villages all around the coast, and they did about the same thing in each one. Then there was a gap, and we don't know why. And then about 2,100 years ago, there was a major resurgence, a lot of activity from the ocean. And in those sites, we find a lot of sea otter bones, as well as other sea mammals. Also in the old days, we had the tule elk in this area. We don't see many here now. There are some herds around. There's some in Hunter Liggett, for example. But in this area, we find the tule elk bones in quite a few of the sites, especially adjacent to grassland. So we find some along Carmel Point, adjacent to the meadows going up the river. We find them along the Salinas River and some places like that. They went extinct in this area quite a while ago. One of the primary food sources, though, was the acorn, but it was used all through time. The earlier people didn't make extensive use of the acorn. This started about 2,500 years ago, just after this major resurgence that I mentioned on the coast. Just after that is when the real intensive use of the acorn started. Before that, the early period people, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 years ago, were more generalist. They were not specialists. They were gatherers rather than collectors. And so they didn't do the intensive acorn processing that's more characteristic of the recent peoples here. Recent, that's the last 1,500, 2,000 years. Now the bedrock mortars, you've all seen those. We have quite a few of these around. You find a few on the peninsula in this area, more of them on the interior, where you had more of the acorn production, more of the oak grasslands.
I didn't see how the people that came down the coast got over to Alaska from Asia.
Okay, the people who came across during the Ice Age, when the land was 1,000 miles north-south connecting Alaska to Asia, they just walked across. And over the millennia and millions of years, animals have gone back and forth quite readily. For example, the horse was a North American animal, and it spread to the Old World through a similar one about 5 million years ago. So the initial peoples came across the Bering Land Bridge, were held up in Alaska by all the glaciers, except for the one group that came through watercraft down the coast, skirting the glaciers. And at the edge of the glaciers, that's where your sea mammals will be. And they do just fine in an ice environment.